So for this chapter, we're going to go out of order a little bit. This is chapter 16. So this corresponds to the deep sea lecture. Not all of these terms are specific for the deep sea. A lot of these are general for ocean and also general ecosystems. So as such, we're going to skip over a few terms just because they're not applicable for this class. So let's start with our terms. So the first one we're going to start with is biodiversity. Biodiversity just refers to the diversity of what is found in an area. Typically, this refers to animals and plants. So if we say something is more diverse, biodiverse, that means it has more species or more different groups of plants and or animals. Brackish is a term that is used to describe water that isn't fresh water and isn't salt water, somewhere in between. So when we were talking about estuaries recently, that would be considered brackish. The next term I want you to know is called carrying capacity. Carrying capacity refers to how many individuals of a particular species of animal or plant can be supported by an environment. So this could be how many elephants are in the Sahara Desert or how many whales are in the Atlantic Ocean. And carrying capacity is determined by something that is limited. So it might be food, it might be space, generally food or space, but it's a variety of different things that can control it. Could be temperature, various things. Climax community is a community or a ecosystem that is at the end of a sequence. When I say sequence, what I'm referring to is the changes that happen to an ecosystem as it is created and as it evolves and changes. Climax is the end. So a good example of a climax community is if you go to a field, an empty field, just dirt, and you watch it. Over time, you'll see weeds and small plants, and then it'll get to smaller trees and then bigger trees. Okay. So climax community is what a community looks like at the end. Clump distribution refers to distribution of animals, but they're all kind of clumped together. So you can think of groups of penguins as a good example. So if you look at penguins on the ice in Antarctica, you typically see them in groups together. You don't see them in a uniform distribution. You don't have them kind of spread out evenly. You have them kind of clumped together. And you see this a lot with different species of animals. So clump distribution is the opposite of uniform distribution. Commensalism is a really big term to describe animals that live together. That's really what it is. So commensalism is animals or plants that live together. And it could be different types of relationships. So we'll talk about different ones in a little bit. Community refers to kind of like a small ecosystem or environment. So if you talk about, like the beach community or the ocean community, you're referring to things that live in that environment. So ocean community, things that live in the ocean, things that live on a beach are called beach community. Control is kind of, it's used to describe experimental science. And I don't want to get too much in the details, but a control is a way to make sure that what you're measuring is what you think you're measuring, right? So if I want to say, you know, trying to think of a good example right now. Drinking coffee makes me more productive, right? So a control for that would be I don't drink coffee and I see how productive I am, okay? And then I drink coffee and I see if my productivity has gone up or down or stayed the same. So control allows you to determine how things are changing. Okay. Copepod, I don't know why they put this in there. This is such a strange term. A copepod is really, it's a tiny little crustacean. You can think of it kind of like a small crab, like the size of the diameter of your hair. Tiny, tiny things. That's as big as they get. And they're called copepods. They're important because a lot of people call them the cows of the sea, right? What they do is they are so abundant in the oceans. They consume a lot of the small plants. Remember the diatoms and all those things we talked about? Copepods eat those, right? So copepods are important in the food web. And a lot of fish, worms, jellyfish, shrimp, clam, I mean, a lot of things eat copepods. They're very important for ecosystems. Deep scattering layer refers to a feature in the deep ocean that was first found by sonar, probably, I'd say the 60s, maybe early 70s. And it was deep in the ocean and it was scattering the sonar. So people would use the sonar to look down in the water and it would bounce back. And it wasn't the bottom of the ocean. So people knew it wasn't the bottom of the ocean, but there was this thing in the ocean that scattered or reflected the sonar back. And it turns out it was fish. It's a very specific type of fish, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They're called myctophids. Don't worry about that, but they're just little fish. They're about this big. Desiccation refers to any time something dries out. So if you're an animal that lives in the ocean and you get stuck out of the water, you will dry out, you'll desiccate. Ecology is the study of, what is ecology? Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with the environment. It's really one of those things where it's a broad term to describe how the environment and organisms interact. So a good example is, human ecology. How do we interact with the environment? And also each other and other species, right? So ecology is a very big field. Environmental resistance is a term that's used to describe when things are able to tolerate or deal with very difficult environmental situations. So desiccation, if you're an animal that lives in the ocean, you might have the ability to stay out of water for a little time, and that would be environmental resistance. Estuary, we had a whole lecture on estuaries, but just briefly, it's where freshwater meets saltwater. That's all an estuary is. Foraminiferan, we talked about this a little bit a long time ago, beginning of this class, when we were talking about microscopic organisms. Right? So foraminifers are the ones with the really beautiful kind of shells that they look like popcorn, actually, but they're very important in different ecosystems. Fundamental niche is a term that is used to describe essentially what an organism does in an ecosystem. It's kind of like what an organism needs to exist. So for example, like koala bears in Australia are a good example. They have a fundamental niche with eucalyptus trees. That is all they eat. And so that is what koala bears do. That's their fundamental niche. Habitat refers to the environment where things are found. So if you want to say, if you're walking on the beach and you're talking about the sand on the beach, that would be beach habitat or sand habitat, right? So things that live in that environment. Skip over that one. Holoplankton, things that float around in the ocean like jellyfish for their whole lives, right? So that's all they do. They don't touch the bottom of the ocean. They don't go out on the beach. They're just float around in the ocean their entire lives. Intertidal zone is, remember when we were talking about tides between high tide and low tide, that's called a tidal range. Tidal range is the difference between high and low tide. The area, the zone between high and low tide is called the intertidal zone. It's between tides, intertidal. Krill is a very small kind of shrimp-like organism, really important for whales in particular, especially the big whales like blue whales and fin whales. The video we watched of upwelling in California talked a lot about krill, because krill are often found in upwelling areas because there's a lot of productivity there. Macroplankton. Plankton is just anything that floats around in the ocean, right? Plankton has no control over where it's going. Macro is something you can see with your eyes, right? So, a jellyfish, macro. Neuroplankton, we'll skip over that. Modal just means it moves, right? So it's able to move. Mutualism is when two or more organisms live together and they benefit each other, right? So you have two species, they live together, they both benefit. So it's not like one is eating the other or taking advantage of the other, they both benefit, mutual, they mutually benefit. Niche. Some of these terms, they must have a minimum number of terms they have to use in each chapter. Fundamental niche and niche, same thing. We'll keep it simple for this class. Parasitism is when two species or two or more interact and one of them is a parasite of the other, right? Takes advantage, preys on, uses somehow another species. That's parasitism. Population is how many of a particular species is in an area, right? So if you want to say, the population of bats in Columbia, South Carolina is 2,000,003. That's how many bats live in Columbia, South Carolina. Population density is just population in an area. So you might want to say this area has 1 million bats per square kilometer, and this has 2 bats per square kilometer. Very different density, right? Random distribution refers to having things occur randomly, right? So it's not like, you're able to predict where something can be found. It's not like, every time you see a rock, you'll see a lizard, right? You might just find lizards all over the place, right? Randomly. Sometimes they're on rocks, sometimes they're on twigs, sometimes they're on sand, sometimes they're in the water. They're all over the place, right? That would be a random distribution. Realized niche, we're gonna skip over that and just niche. Just know that niche is kind of where a species fits into an environment. Sessile means it doesn't move, right? So the opposite of modal, right? Sessile doesn't move like, what's a good example of sessile? Like a tree, right? Once a tree is growing somewhere, a tree doesn't get up and walk around. Species-specific relationship refers to typically relationships where there is a relationship where they need a specific species. So for example, a lot of Fish in the ocean have species-specific relationships with other fish, right? So they're different species and they interact. They might have mutualism or some other, or even parasitism, but they need specific species for that relationship. Succession is related to what I was talking about with climax community. Succession is just the changes that a community undergoes, right? Succession is the different stages, right? So you can think about a field with weeds, a field with trees, a field with big trees, right? That's succession. Symbiosis is a specific type of mutualism that is very closely related to each other. So symbiosis is they have evolved over time to be dependent on each other. If you take these two species that are symbiotic and you separate them, neither can survive. They need each other to survive. Symbiosis. It's a specific type of mutualism. Uniform distribution refers to when you find species that are not random and not clumped, but they're kind of everywhere. So if you go to, say, Antarctica, and you see penguins every meter, right? As far as you can see, just penguins are exactly 1 meter apart. That's uniform. Sometimes you see that, especially when they have their nest, right? Each nest of a penguin, for example, is usually about 3 to 4 feet away from every other nest. So when you look at it, it looks like a uniform pattern, right? They're exactly 3 to 4 feet away from each other. Wave shock. Wave shock refers to when a wave breaks in the intertidal zone. If you're a little thing living on the beach and a big wave falls on you, that's a shock, right? It's a lot of energy in that wave. Whale falls is, I want you to know this term, is when a whale is living in the ocean, but whales die, and they fall or sink to the bottom of the ocean. And whale falls are a very unique ecosystem that we're going to talk a lot about in the asynchronous video from the deep sea. And then the last term is zooplankton. Zooplankton, zoo means animal, plankton means something that floats around in the water. So these are animals that float around in the water. Typically, zooplankton are pretty small, like these little copepods, right? These little super tiny little crab-like things that live in the water. And that's really it. Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. Hope it helped. And let me know if you have any questions at all.